Hey, welcome back to our channel. My name is Tina and I'm part of the creative team here at KG Imagery. For those of you who have been following us for a while, you know that our roots are in photography, so we wanted to share some basic camera tips with you. Today, in our DSLR camera basics tutorial, we'll talk about three main topics: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We'll look at how understanding these three components can really improve your photography. Now, as a side note, you don't need to go out to invest in an expensive camera. Use what you have already and learn how to use it well. Our team at KG Imagery loves to invest, in knowledge that is, and we're always learning new things. Let's first start with aperture. When you look through the viewfinder or in the back of the screen, you're going to see a number at the bottom that has an F, followed by a number. That's your aperture. The aperture controls how much light enters your camera, and it's measured in f-stops. A lower aperture number means that your iris, or physical mechanism that's closing down and opening up, is wider, allowing more light to enter your camera. On the other hand, a higher number means that the iris is closed down, allowing less light to enter. Now, there's a secondary effect to changing your aperture, and that's known as depth of field. Essentially, depth of field is the separation between your in-focus objects and your out-of-focus objects. With a lower aperture number, when your iris is open really wide, you're going to have a shallower depth of field. Your subject will stand out from your background more. Take a look at this shot of the subject. With a wider aperture, corresponding to a lower f-stop number, you can see that only a fraction of the image is in focus. Now, if we close the aperture down, that's going to increase our depth of field, which will mean that more of that subject is in focus. However, the downside of that is we now have less light, and you can see that the image is now significantly darker. That's where the other two settings come into play. So far, we've discussed aperture. Next, let's talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed measures the amount of time that light is going to be hitting your camera's sensor. So when you look at your camera, that's the fraction you're going to see next to your aperture reading. Most cameras will allow you to have your shutter open for a few seconds, all the way down to a few thousandths of a second. The longer that shutter's open, the more light you're going to get into the camera sensor. Now, there is a side effect associated with shutter speed as well, and that's called motion blur. This picture that we took was taken with a shutter speed of 1/200, and you can see that the subject's features are completely out of focus and blurry. If we increase the shutter speed, you can see that everything in that shot is tack sharp, and there is no motion blur. And the reason for that is because a fast shutter speed means you're taking a picture of a smaller portion of time. Now, there are definitely going to be situations where you want to leave your shutter open for a long period of time. Now that we're a little more familiar with aperture and shutter speed, let's talk about the last main setting, which is ISO. The best way to think about ISO is kind of like a volume knob. ISO controls the amount of voltage that goes across your camera's sensor. So with a higher ISO number, you're going to increase that voltage, and with a lower ISO number, you're going to decrease that voltage. Just like the other two settings, there is a caveat that comes into play with your ISO. The more voltage that goes across your camera's sensor means you're going to introduce more noise into your image, which is not going to necessarily look as good as a clean image. If you crank that ISO too high, you run the risk of completely ruining your image. If you find yourself having to crank your ISO, do your best to add more light to the scene. Obviously, there will be times where you can't add more light to the scene. You're going to have to use the other two settings to kind of adjust your exposure to get the proper shot. Now, I do want to mention that there are going to be times when you're going to have too much light coming into your camera. Typically, that happens when you're shooting outdoors or midday or something like that. Now, this is where ND filters come into play. Essentially, the way to look at an ND filter is like sunglasses for your camera. If you want to learn more about ND filters, leave a request in the comments. We really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions, go ahead and drop them down in the comments below. And while you're there, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. It really does make a difference for us here on the channel. Until next time, be inspired, stay inspired.